What is Tourette Syndrome? It's a neurological disorder that causes those who have it to make involuntary body movements and sounds, twitches and noises we call tics. It's an equal opportunity condition. It affects all races, religions, and nationalities. My husband has it, as does my 8-year-old son. That's why I'm talking to you today. One of the most significant things I learned was the major impact that you as teachers can have on students with TS, contributing to their success not only in your classroom, but also in their future lives. There is no more qualified, more experienced source for learning how to help your students cope with TS than Susan Connors. Susan has been an award-winning teacher for 33 years, who herself has Tourette syndrome, which went undiagnosed until age 36. She has presented hundreds of workshops in the United States and around the world. Please listen to and learn from Susan Connors.
Now, I know there are people out here who have worked with kids with Tourette, some who probably, it's completely new to you. You've never worked with kids with Tourette before. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm going to basically start at the beginning and give you all the facts and figures. I think that would be the most important thing to do. Now, I think you can understand that Tourette syndrome is a hereditary disorder. And you understand that because I just talked about 22 family members that have Tourette. That's not really coincidence. We didn't catch it from each other. It was hereditary. You also need to understand that Tourette is a neurological disorder, and I think probably most people realize that. And neurological is simply a chemical imbalance in your brain. That's all it is. And we also know from lots of research that's being done that Tourette is, the main brain chemical involved in diagnosing Tourette is dopamine. Now, I'm not going to sit here and talk about brain chemicals. I'm not a doctor, and I don't pretend to be, but I want you to kind of understand, I think one of the mysteries of Tourette is that people clearly cannot get a grasp on how this is a medical condition because it looks like an emotional, psychological, and is almost always misdiagnosed as that. But when you think about dopamine, the one disease that probably comes to everyone's mind is Parkinson's disease. Tourette syndrome is not Parkinson's disease. I'm not here to tell you that, but it's the same brain chemical. The difference is that we're probably getting too much, or it's misfiring in your brain, or something like that is happening, and we're getting movements that we can't control. And these movements are called tics. That's all they're called. The main feature of Tourette is a tic. That's the main feature of it. And we're going to talk about what that means and you know, how all that all ties together. Another really important thing you need to know is at this point, we still have not come up with a clinical medical test that diagnoses Tourette syndrome. And I think, I know in my lifetime we probably will. We're getting closer and closer all the time. It's a genetic disorder. We're doing all kinds of medical research. We just haven't found the test yet. And we also know that doctors love medical tests. They like to be able to look at a CAT scan or an MRI and see something off in the brain. And as a result of that, you can say, oh, there it is, that's Tourette syndrome. That's not going to happen with Tourette. Doctors who work with this disorder, who are specialists in this disorder, neurologists and psychiatrists have also in the last several years gotten very involved with working with people with Tourette syndrome, have come up with clinical criteria for diagnosis. And there are 4 of them that you have to fulfill to have a diagnosis. So I'm going to go through all 4 of them so you can get an idea when you're looking at a child. If you are seeing these 4 things and you think that might be Tourette, you're probably on the right path to getting that kid to somebody who can clinically diagnose them. Now, the first criteria is multiple motor tics. Now, if you don't know what a motor tic is, I'm kind of like show and tell when I present, okay? Because I have a lot of motor tics. You see me shaking my head from side to side. That's what the kids at school call my no tic. They'll come up and say, Ms. Connors, can I go to the bathroom? I'll go, yes. I shake my head from side to side because I just go. I said yes, go. Don't worry about it because I constantly do that. It's an embarrassing tic to have. It's not one of the worst ones I've had, but it's embarrassing. But a tic is basically, if you want to define a tic, it's a rapid, repetitive movement of a muscular group in your body. That's all it is. Like I'm rapidly and repeatedly shaking my head. It's a muscular group in my body. You'll see me do this. That's a motor tic. I do that all the time. Now, I said at the beginning that I was a French teacher. I travel in the summer with my students to France. In some countries, this is not very nice. I just want to tell you that. And I tend to get myself in a lot of trouble when I'm in some countries doing that. So, that's one that in this country they look at you a little funny, but they don't really say too much. But in Italy, this isn't very nice. So it's a rapid, repetitive movement of a muscular group in your body. And fortunately for people with Tourette, they only affect the voluntary muscles. This is not a degenerative disorder. It's not like Huntington's disease or some other diseases that kind of look a little like Tourette in the beginning stages. It doesn't degenerate and eventually affect the involuntary muscles. We're not going to die from this. That's the good news. The good news is we're not going to die from it. 3 of the 4 kids in my school this year with Tourette are currently in my class. And, I've got one that has very obvious tics, and I've got another one whose tics are relatively mild, and most teachers tell me they don't really see them that much. I mean, I see them, but I'm real in tune to tics because I have a lot of tics and I notice them. But he does an eye-rolling tic, roll his eyes back and forth. So it's a movement. He does it all the time. He has a tic where he'll kind of, like this. Not a big deal, but it does it. And he also has a tapping tic where he constantly has to be tapping something, which, imagine teaching your class and he's up there with his pencil or he's up there with his, ruler or whatever, and he's constantly got to be tapping. And those are pretty much the tics that he has right now that are anywhere near obvious. But if you're not really looking at that child while you're teaching, and how many of us can teach our classes and focus on one child? You can't do it. You got 25 other ones in there you got to focus on. So people don't notice his tics that much. But it doesn't mean that those tics aren't interfering. We talked a lot about the multiple motor tics, but now we're going to talk about the vocal tics. Now, the vocal tics, to me, are the hardest part about having Tourette syndrome. The motor tics, if I go to a movie theater, I'll always sit toward the back or in a corner somewhere by myself. I still get kicked out, but at least I try. Okay, and if I'm having movements, nobody really pays that much attention. But the vocal tics are the things that get me kicked out of movie theaters all the time. The first thing you hear is from the people around you. And, they're starting to get annoyed. Okay, then you start, people tapping you on the back and telling you to stop whatever you're doing. And then the third thing is the usher with a flashlight and it's time to leave. So I don't go. But I'm very lucky. We live in the world of videos. I can rent what I want, I can watch what I want, and I can tic when I want, and I really don't have to worry about going to the movies. But unfortunately, kids in school do not have that option. They have to go to school. Now, a vocal tic is exactly what it sounds like. It is a noise, a sound, a word, or something that you utter that is rapid, repetitive, and not appropriate to what's going on around you. It doesn't fit in, shall we say. My first vocal tic was one that I dare say 16, 17 years ago, I never would have even thought of as a tic, and that was a sniffing tic. I was constantly sniffing. Who would suspect that's a sniffing tic? Now, where do you suppose that got me? Yes, the allergist. He was called to the scene next. Okay. I was blowing my nose 300 times a day. Did it make a difference? No. It wasn't that I had to blow my nose. It was a vocal tic. A vocal tic can be as simple as a throat clearing tic. That's a vocal tic. But it doesn't have to be a huge, big noise that you make. But I've also worked with kids who just shout out words. Now, the little boy I have in my class this year in 8th grade, I've had him as a student for 4 years now. And when he first came into my class in 5th grade, I was taking attendance, as we all do that first day of school, and all of a sudden I started hearing, "Bah, moo," from the corner of the room. And I kind of looked around like, A few minutes later, bah, we heard it again. And I'm thinking, I'm not making that noise. Somebody else in this room has got Tourette Syndrome. So lo and behold, it was Marty. And he's in 8th grade now, and his vocal tics have gotten much worse. And in the class that he's in, nobody really pays that much attention to them. They just know that's Marty. They realize that's what he does. It's just part of the class as we teach, and that's what he does. Now, he has now developed some very strange vocal tics. He'll shout out, "I've got a chicken in my pants." That's his latest vocal tic. "I got a chicken in my pants." And of course, everybody just laughs. It's funny, and we go on with class. But you can imagine the kind of trouble that kid would get into if we didn't know he had Tourette syndrome. It's a tic. I mean, that's what he says. Tics can be words. They can be phrases. They can be anything like that that comes out of your mouth. Now, I think if anybody knows anything about Tourette syndrome, the one thing you probably have heard about is the particular tic that takes the form of inappropriate language. Am I right? You've all heard about that. Now, is there such a tic? Yes, it does exist. It's called coprolalia. We like to name our tics because it makes us feel important. Okay, we have names for them. Now, coprolalia is the uttering of inappropriate language connected as a tic. That's what it is. Do you have to have this for a diagnosis? No, absolutely not. But do you need to know about it? Of course you do. And I would dare say that Marty's "I have a chicken in my pants" could be classified as coprolalia, because it is quite inappropriate, okay, especially for an 8th grade boy. That's not a good thing to say. But it's usually a swear word. So you can understand that even though it's not necessary for a diagnosis, it's something that you really need to understand. It can develop at any time. Most people won't get it. Most people will not. It doesn't have to be a curse word. We have people who utter ethnic slurs. I had a boy about 7 or 8 years ago. It was kind of a sad situation, and he had ethnic slurs and curse words. And by the time the school called me to come down and do some intervention and speak with classmates, etc., he'd already had 2 fingers in his arm broken by other students because he was using these ethnic slurs and he was getting beaten up, and it was just horrible. And nobody understood that it was just not something that he meant to say. It was just part and parcel of the Tourette syndrome. That's just the way it is. So a vocal tic, as you can understand, is probably one of the most difficult parts. Whether you have the coprolalia or not, it gets you kicked out of places. I had a teacher who recently said to me, I tell Marty to stop that, and he stops it. So he's not doing that because he has to. He's doing it on purpose. That's kind of the dichotomy with Tourette. It's an uncontrollable movement disorder, but we have very short periods of time when we can control it. But I say to her, it's not a good thing to tell him to stop it. First of all, he's not doing it because he wants to. And secondly, when you tell him to stop it and he tries really, really, really hard to control it and is successful for a few minutes to do that, what happens? He can't concentrate on anything you're teaching because all he's concentrating on is holding that tic in. Can't at all. And eventually, the longer you hold in tics, it's kind of like holding in a sneeze. The longer you hold it in, the worse it's going to be. You're going to sneeze and you hold it in and you hold it in, and eventually you have this horrible explosive sneeze. And so eventually he's going to have really a tic outburst, or it could be a behavior outburst because of the anxiety of trying to hold this in. So it's not a good thing to encourage kids to do. If you see them having a difficult time, better that you send them for a walk, better that you send them on an errand, tell them they look thirsty, go get a drink of water, any number of things that you can do. We've got multiple motor tics. We've got vocal tics, which now you understand a little bit better. And we also have something called waxing and waning. Now, waxing and waning really has 2 meanings. Waxing and waning, first of all, means the tics constantly change. So, don't get crazy over it. They're going to change all the time. As children, tics change constantly. I know a lot of kids with Tourette, and every 3 or 4 weeks you'll see them that have new tics. Old ones disappear, new ones take their place. As an adult, they tend to settle in for longer periods of time. I've got like that teeth clacking tic, which I've had probably for 15, 16 years. I've had that for a long time. And try as I may to get rid of it, I just can't seem to get rid of it. And I think you can understand that adult brain chemicals don't change like kids' brain chemicals change. And so the tics tend to settle in for much longer periods of time than you would as a child. But waxing and waning also means something else. It also means that tics change in severity depending on environmental circumstances. And some of the things that worsen Tourette, there are basically 3 of them, or anything connected with Tourette. One of them is stress and anxiety. And I think you can understand that anybody under stress and anxiety, things worsen. I don't care what neurological, impairment that you have. And we don't necessarily think about it, but kids' days, even 2nd graders, are filled with stress for them. I look at my average 8th grader and think, what are you worried about? You got the world by a string, but my God, they woke up with a pimple on their nose and the big dance is tomorrow. Really, how could I be so insensitive as to think they wouldn't be stressed out over that? So stressors that we don't really think about can tremendously affect these children. And, testing situations are stressful. Another thing that aggravates Tourette is excitement, which we often tend to forget about. Tics are aggravated by excitement. I've had teachers call me and say, we're going on a field trip. It's the end of the year. It's summer vacation. Why are his tics so bad? He's excited. Grandma's coming to visit. It's his birthday. It's a holiday. I don't care. Whatever you've got, excitement aggravates tics. And the third thing that tends to aggravate tics is fatigue. When kids are tired, their tics are almost always worse. And I think you can understand that. Your defenses are down, you're having a hard time anyway, and it just happens. And you have to be tolerant of that. And you maybe have to send them on one more errand or do one more thing to kind of help them out. You can start with this disorder anywhere between the ages of 2 and 18. 2 being very young, and 18 already being quite old, although I worked with a family whose son first started with tics when he was 16, which was very unusual. The average age of onset is about 6 or 7. That's when most people start with their first tics. So if you're an elementary teacher, that's probably where you're going to see it. It doesn't mean it has to start there, but that's pretty classic to start at that age. Tourette syndrome is sometimes accompanied by other neurological disorders, comorbid conditions, whatever you want to call them. And there are three biggies that we're going to talk about in the course of the day. One of them is called OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. The other one is called ADHD. You all know a lot about that, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the third one is learning disabilities. Sometimes children have at least three, if not all four of these disorders coexisting. I call obsessive compulsive disorder tics of the mind. That's what I call it. My body ticks, my head will jerk, or I'll jerk my shoulder, or whatever, and then my mind ticks. I get stuck on things and I can't move on from it. Now, an obsession is a thought that your mind gets stuck on. The compulsion is what you have to do to alleviate that obsession, if that makes sense to you. Now, I think if anybody knows anything about OCD, a lot of the television programs that have been done about OCD focus on one particular obsession, and that's a germ obsession. And that's probably the one that everybody knows about, and that's the first thing you think about when you think about OCD is an obsession with germs. Now, the obsession is germs. The compulsion is to wash. I had worked with a lot of kids over the years who have germ obsessions. One of them is a little girl, and basically what she said to me is, right now I am suffering from boy germs. And I said, Melanie, I think you're going to have to explain this one to me because I don't think I've ever heard about boy germs before. She said, well, what happens is, she was 14 at the time that this kind of hit her. I walk down the hall between change of classes, and if I bump into a boy, I feel like I get boy germs. And in order to alleviate the boy germs, I have to hold my breath until I can find a bathroom and wash my hands. Now, how many times a day do you suppose she bumped into a boy in the hallways? I mean, hundreds. It just is, ridiculous when you think about change of classes in a busy middle school. And so how many times a day was this poor little girl holding her breath, running to a bathroom, holding her breath, running to a bathroom? At first, her mother and I had spoken at length, and her mother thought that at 14, boy germs wasn't such a bad thing, and so she wasn't really going to do too much about it. But then we realized how much it was affecting her schoolwork, how much it was affecting her social emotional well-being, and so they went to see the doctor, and the doctor decided that it was time to start her on medication. But, germs are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to OCD. I'm going to name some of the other things, and I'm always afraid to talk too much about this in an audience because people start thinking they have it, you start diagnosing yourself, and I want you to understand that everybody has a touch of OCD. I really believe that. Everybody has certain things that they obsess a little bit about, but when I talk to you about this, you'll understand that you don't all have a diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder. Not that we don't check things. Everybody checks things. That's fine. It's good to check and make sure the stove is turned off, and it's good to check and make sure the coffee pot's unplugged, because that's how we prevent our houses from burning down. That's fine. But it turns into the disorder when you do it so many times that it is disruptive of what you're trying to get done, and that's go to work in the morning. Now, some of the ones that have plagued me and other people that I've worked with, I've always had a need for symmetry. Symmetry has been a huge thing in my life. And I'm talking not just like you have to have the picture straight on your wall. That's just part of it. I would get completely ready for school in the morning. I'd have my bag packed and ready to leave, car keys in hand, and it would take me 45 minutes to get out of my door because of all my compulsions and obsessions that I had to go through. And one of them was the symmetry. I would straighten this blind, then I would straighten this blind, then I would straighten this blind, and then I would stand back, and they didn't look exactly right, so I do them again, and I do them again. And there were days when I would drive out of my garage across the front of my house, and they still didn't look right. And I would go back into my house and straighten them all over again. I mean, what if the blind police should come during the day and see how I live? You know what I mean? I had to go back and do this. And there was no rhyme or reason for it. I just had to do it. I think I finally realized that I needed drugs for this disorder, so to speak, when I became obsessed with the milk carton being perfectly symmetrical on the refrigerator shelf. I mean, the rest of the refrigerator could have been in total chaos, but that milk carton was going to be straight. And one morning, I remember being ready to leave my house. I went back 8 times to check the milk carton. And I suddenly realized that I wasn't going to get to work if I didn't do something. So I did the only humanly thing possible. I took the milk to work with me. I had no choice. I had to get it out of my refrigerator, and that's what I did. Now, my home base was thrilled because they got cookies and milk for breakfast, and they had no idea I was just trying to resolve my obsessive-compulsive problem. And I think that's when I suddenly realized that I had to have help with this. I wasn't able to function. Nobody should take 45 minutes to get out of their house. Now, what happens when you tell a person with OCD they cannot carry out their compulsions? Back out of the way, okay? Because they become very anxious, very angry, very uptight, and they're bound to have some sort of a behavior problem. So many times we as educators miss the red flags with OCD, and there are a lot of red flags with OCD. This is Dan's red flag. He walks into my class, he has 3 pencil cases, and every one of them is filled to capacity with sharpened pencils. Then he has another one filled with pens that work. I'm talking about 25, 30 pens pencils in each one. Then every binder for every subject is about 5 inches thick, okay? And he carries everything he owns with him everywhere he goes. And he walks into my room, and the books are over his head, and he can't even see where he's going. And he puts them down on the desk. And the other day, he got up, and he raised his hand, and he said, "Miss Connors, one of my pencils is missing." he just shouts out OCD. He is so obsessive. But he's bright, he's funny, and we've actually gotten him this year to laugh a little bit about this. Another red flag is a kid, for example, who will be writing things and constantly erasing them. Write and erase, write and erase, write and erase. It doesn't look symmetrical to them. It doesn't look like it should look. The G doesn't look like the G in the sentence before that. It's got to be perfect. That's a red flag, OCD. I work with a girl who was OCD when she was like a junior in high school, took the form of, at the end of every sentence that she read, when she was reading anything, a textbook, a novel, I don't care what she was reading, at the end of every sentence, she had to stop and count the words in that sentence and record it at the end. Can you imagine this? And then she'd go on to the next one. And then you wouldn't be quite sure you did it, so you'd go back and you'd count it again, because you never know. Some of you, as old as I am, may remember that we used to have these lovely reading groups. And the reading groups always had bird names. Do you remember this? We had the bluebirds, and we had the blackbirds, and the robins, and we all knew the best reading group was the bluebirds. Everybody wanted to be a bluebird. Well, I happened to be a good reader, so I was a bluebird. But suddenly, I developed this obsession. And I remember it as if it were yesterday. I would read 5 words in my reader, and I would stop, and in my head, I had to count to 25. Read 5 words, I had to stop, and I had to count to 25. Nobody ever saw me do that, because I was doing it in my head. Stop, count to 25. Now, what does the teacher of the bluebird group think? She doesn't know the next word, because she's hesitating. So I got moved from the bluebirds to the robins to the cardinals. I ended up in the buzzards. It's not a good scene. I did not want to be a buzzard. But, somebody said to me, "Why didn't you just tell her?" Well, there are a couple of reasons why people with OCD, especially kids, don't talk about it. The first and foremost was you have nothing to compare it to. How did I know as an 8-year-old that other people weren't counting in their head? How did I know that? I had no way of knowing that. And the second thing is you're afraid to tell people because you're afraid that they're going to think you're crazy. Because basically you think you're crazy. Why do you have to keep doing these things over and over and over again? I've worked with kids over the years that have so many obsessions and compulsions that they hide so well that they're just not functioning. They're not functioning at all, and nobody picks up on it because kids don't tell you. They don't talk about it. You see little signs here or there if the parents don't tell you, and you don't see the big red flag, recognize the red flag, then they can go on undiagnosed for years and years. So, if you can just figure them out, talk to these kids, figure out what they're going through. And I think you can see how this disorder, as insidious as it is, how it interferes with everything you try to do. The tics are interfering. We talked about that, and we went through all kinds of examples. But I think the OCD can be even more interfering. But it's very hard for kids and for teachers to get a handle on OCD because they simply don't see it as they see the tics. I'm going to try to go through the symptomology of ADHD because it's a very misunderstood disorder. And so many times we look at the ADHD and we overlook all the other stuff that may be going along with it. Now, obviously, because of the name of it, it's a disorder of hyperactivity. These are the kids who are fidgeting with their books, fidgeting with pencils, with anything that they have around them. These are the kids that are never on their chair. They're over their chair, under their chair, over their desk, under their desk. They just can't seem to sit still. These are the kids that probably drive us the craziest in a classroom. But besides these kids being hyperactive, these kids also have attention deficit. An attention deficit is exactly what it sounds like. They cannot focus for any period of time. Now, we say that, but I hear this all the time from teachers. I hear teachers say, if they're watching a video that they're really interested in, they can focus fine. If they're playing Nintendo, there's no problem with their attention. And that's kind of the strangeness of this disorder. It's really a matter of over-focusing or under-focusing. If it's something that you're really, really interested in, and especially something that's kind of fast-paced and a lot of visual and a lot of action in it, you're going to be very focused to the point, how many of you try to drag kids like this away from Nintendo? It's almost impossible because they are so over-focused on it, you can't drag them away from it. Yet you put them in a science class that isn't particularly interesting, and you can't get them to pay attention for 2 seconds in that classroom. Part of what's happening is that the attention problems are directly related to auditory sensitivity. In other words, these kids tend to hear things all the same. Everybody knows an electric clock makes kind of a humming sound. I don't really hear that humming sound, but that kid with ADHD hears that humming sound. And it's loud to them like a truck driving by, and so they're kind of overtaken by that, and they can't focus on anything else in the classroom that's going on. What is the worst place to put these kids? In the back of your classroom. Because there's a lot going on between you and that back row. I hate to tell you, but there's a lot of things happening, and they're not really able to focus on what you're teaching because they got too many other distractions that they're focusing on because they're loud to them like anything, just taking over anything else they're trying to listen to that the teacher is saying. So it's very important that these kids have preferential seating simply for the fact that they can't pay attention for long periods of time. Now, I'm not advocating, especially if the kid also has Tourette and tics, to put them center front of your classroom. I've made that mistake. I put a kid one time right in the dead center in front of my desk, and after 3 days, he came up and he was practically in tears. He said, "I can't sit there." I said, "But honey, you really do much better when you're sitting up front." And we talked about that, and you agreed that would be a good place. He said, "But everybody's watching my tics." And I hadn't really thought about that. He had a head-shaking tic, and he had a couple of other, like, shoulder-shrugging, and he felt like, because he was the center of that classroom, that everybody was aware of what he was doing. So for me, the best place for those kids is kind of up front, but on the side. So they're not, like, right there in dead center. And not only that, I find, like, Marty, it's funny because he's an 8th grader, and he's fairly aware of all the things that are going on with him. But this year he came into my classroom and he got the same seat he has for the last 4 years. That's the front seat up by the door. And at the end of class he came up and he said, "I want to protest. I've been sitting in the same seat in your class for 4 years." I said, "Right, that's exactly right." That is the perfect place for him because I give him a triangle of space between that desk, the door, and my desk. And that's his space for him to get up and move. He has a movement disorder. I find that when Marty gets up and lies down on the floor on his stomach and fidgets with something, he's probably learning a whole lot more than if I'm making him sit in that chair with his hands folded and his feet on the floor. Because that's all he can concentrate on is trying to hold still, and he can't do it. Now, besides attention deficit, the inability to pay attention for long periods of time, and besides the fact that these kids are very hyperactive, fidgety, there are other characteristics of ADHD, one of them being impulsivity. These kids are some of the most impulsive kids you'll ever work with. They never think of consequences before they act. These are kids that will shout out an answer before they get their hand in the air. These are kids that will interrupt you when you think they're most into your lesson with, shout out, "Can I go to the bathroom?" And they're not paying attention at all to what you're saying. They're just very difficult kids to teach because they're very impulsive. They just don't think things through. These are kids who have what we call lack of executive function of the brain. Now, I'm going to demonstrate to you a typical ADHD kid coming into your class. I don't know if I can do this because I don't have enough materials. Is this right? This is how they arrive in your class. And they walk in and everything kind of drops on the desk. And then you say, "Take out your homework." What homework? Have they got their homework? No, of course not. These kids don't have executive function to organize. They're the kids who have the wrong textbook, they have the wrong folder, they do their homework and they lose it. They lose everything. We're talking about shoes, winter coats, glasses. I mean, these kids lose everything. It's like you pack their bags in the morning and you get them all ready to go into school. Parents can tell you this. Get set, everything all organized and signed. By the time they get to school, it's gone. We don't know where it went to. I categorize kids who come to class without a pencil into 3 categories. Number 1, they're the kids who just don't care. Bad attitude. Number 2, the kid who was walking down the hall and had 2 pencils, but somebody knocked them out of their hand, and they got swept up in the crowd, and they just simply lost them. And number 3, your ADHD kids. Now, how many of the just don't care kids are there? There aren't that many of them. They really aren't. That's the minority. I may find one in the course of a class day that just simply says, "I refuse to bring a pencil because I don't want to bring a pencil and I don't care and I don't want to learn." For the majority of kids, they're the real good kid who always brings a pencil, but just that one day lost their pencil, or their pencil broke, or their pen ran out of ink, or whatever, or they're the ADHD kid. So why am I worried about it? Maybe it's because I've taught for 33 years, and you get this way after you teach for 33 years. I have long since given up worrying about pencils. You know what I'm saying? I just cannot worry about pencils anymore. I have a box of pencils on my desk, and kids are allowed to borrow a pencil. They don't have a pencil. I'm not going to worry about it anymore. Now, if you're really hung up on pencils and keeping track of your pencils, that's really a priority of yours, then what I do is I have them give me something in ransom when they take a pencil. So, for example, if they take a pencil, they have to leave me a shoe. That's what I take. I take one of their shoes. And their shoe stays by my desk, and then unless they give me the pencil back, they can't have their shoe back. But I want to be honest with you. I have seen ADHD kids walk out of my room without their shoes. I have seen this happen. Okay, it's not unusual. They do that. It's kind of hard, I believe, for people who don't have this disorder to truly have an understanding of what it's like to live with this disorder. So we're going to do a little experiential exercise. What I'm going to have you do when I say go is you're going to write the pledge to the flag. Now, this is something that we hear every single day of our lives, right? We all know this inside out and backward. However, you have Tourette Syndrome. So every time that I clap my hands, like that, you are going to do the tic that you probably haven't even seen me do up here because I'm doing it behind the podium. And that is probably one of my most interfering tics, which you don't even notice. I take this little finger and I hit it on the page. Whenever I clap my hands, you're going to take this little finger and you're going to hit it on the page that you're writing on. You're also obsessive compulsive. So every third word that you write doesn't look quite right to you. So you're going to cross it out and you're going to rewrite it. So we have this. Every time I clap my hands, tick with the finger you're writing with. Every third word, you're going to cross out and you're going to rewrite. Okay, 1.5 minutes. Are we ready? Begin. Remember, neatness is very important. Don't forget your every third word. Time is almost up. Time is up. How many finished? Nobody in this room finished? Okay, somebody tell me how you felt while you were doing this. Frustrated. That's the first word that comes out of people's mouth. Totally frustrated. How many of you lost track of what you were writing? Yeah, exactly. How many of you feel this is a true evaluation of how well you know the pledge to the flag? Nobody's going to raise their hand on that one. As educators, and not knowing this, we would be collecting these and looking at this poor sixth grader and say, honey, you've been in school for 7 years, you don't know the pledge. I can't understand this. How could you not know? We say it every day. Does this mean the kid doesn't know the pledge? Of course not. It just means given the symptoms of their disorder, they can't write it down. And you know, in all honesty, did I really give you Tourette syndrome? The first criteria was multiple motor tics. I also didn't give you a vocal tic. I also didn't give you ADHD. I gave you one tic, one compulsion, and you couldn't get through it. So I hope that as you go back to your schools, that you keep in mind this little frustrating exercise that I made you do, because it truly is an example of what these kids go through. And just a slight example, because again, as I say, I didn't even really give you Tourette. I just gave you one tic and one obsession, and you couldn't get through a very simple exercise. How could we have had the kids do this? They could say it. If you're hung up on them writing it and spelling it, then you could have them do it on a word processor. There are so many ways you could do this without making them write it if you first understand how this disorder interferes. The problem is trying to understand to begin with. I want to talk about learning disabilities. Kids with Tourette, their disabilities tend to be more commonly in the area of nonverbal learning disabilities. That tends to be where they center. And they center around basically two things. First of all, something we call auditory processing, central auditory processing. Now, auditory processing to the average person out there just simply means that people don't process what you're saying to them like everybody else processes it. For example, these are the kids that you say, you know, you want to close the door, and 20 seconds later they close the door. They're still processing. If you have a child with this disorder, and on Saturday morning you decide to give them 3 jobs to do, I want you to sweep the garage, make your bed, and take out the garbage, and then you can go out to play. How many of those jobs will they get done? 1 at best, if at all. because that's all they process. They didn't hear the other two. And of course, you're out there like the banshee mother, screaming, "You didn't do your 3 jobs!" And the kid doesn't even know you gave him 3 jobs to do. He only heard one of them. He didn't process them because they can't process like everybody else processes. This is a non-verbal learning disability. So what can you do to alleviate that? Put a note on the refrigerator with the 3 jobs. Say when you do one, come in, cross it off, take a break, do the next one. Cross it off, do the next one. Don't give them 3 things to do at one time. Give them 1 thing to do. And probably the biggest area of disability, a learning disability with our kids, is the nonverbal learning disability that we refer to as fine motor, visual motor impairment. These kids notoriously have fine motor difficulties. It's a nonverbal learning disability. And it means that their handwriting is very sloppy. They have trouble staying on a line. They have trouble keeping margins. Their margins will go sideways instead of straight up and down. They have trouble forming letters. They'll forget what a letter looks like even though they've, I'll be writing a word. I have this disability. I'll be writing a word and all of a sudden I forget what an H looks like. It's like, I learned that about 50 years ago. I should be able to remember that word or that letter, and it just doesn't come to me because it's a nonverbal learning disability. I have fine motor problems. And not only that, kids with fine motor problems have a really hard time with hand cramping. You'll see them write about 3 words, and they have to stop and they have to shake their hand out because their fine motor skills are terrible. Now, how do we expect a kid with this kind of a disability to function in a classroom when they can't write? We give them a computer. That's the bottom line. These kids should be trained on computers from day 1. I'm not saying never teach them how to form letters, but you are never going to be able to read their handwriting. In addition to the fine motor, a lot of these kids also have what we call visual motor problems. Now, visual motor is basically what your mind sees does not get down on the paper. There's a short circuit somewhere between what you see and motorically what gets down. For example, you might see a word in your mind that's spelled T-H-E-R-E, and you write it down T-H-E-E-R. You might see the assignment on the blackboard that says page 21 through 10, and you write page 10, 1 through 20. You copy it wrong. From the book, they copy the math problem wrong. They line the numbers up wrong. They have a horrible disability in this area that so many times gets overlooked. Now, who in your school would be a good person to deal with this? Occupational therapists. We don't involve OTs in our kids a lot. We should. We should always involve OTs with these kids. Fine motor, visual motor is a huge area of concern for our kids. You've got to stop looking at the symptoms and you've got to look at the kid. That's one thing that I have built my teaching career on. You look at the kid, and I was a kid sitting in the class. I was obsessing about everything. I was counting words. I was being moved from bluebirds to buzzards and all these other things. I was making noises. I had so many symptoms, and never once was anything said to me. I was just Sue Connor sitting in that classroom. I was just a kid, and they looked at the work I could do and not the work that I couldn't do. It was a novel thing. It doesn't happen a lot now. It really doesn't. We tend to look more at symptoms than we do at kids. I grew up as a person with Tourette who was ignorant of Tourette. My whole generation was ignorant of Tourette syndrome. I didn't even know I had it till I was 36 years old. I want to raise the next generation so they're not ignorant of Tourette. So one of the things I think we so often forget to do is we forget to educate kids. We forget to talk to kids about what Tourette syndrome is and what OCD is. And I think the more they know, the better they deal with it. Kids tend to tease and make fun of what they don't understand. If they don't understand it, they're going to pick on it. Think about interruptions in your class. In a 40-minute class, how many times does the loudspeaker come on with a stupid announcement? Okay. How many times does somebody sneeze? How many times does somebody drop their pencil? How many times does somebody blow their nose? Why don't we get disrupted by that? Because we know what they are. If somebody blows their nose, probably because they have a cold. If somebody sneezes, allergies. Nobody, you stop, you listen, you go on. But when somebody says, I have a chicken in my pants, the class comes to a halt. But once you realize what it is, the class doesn't have to come to a halt anymore. So it's kind of building an immunity, I guess, building an understanding of what these kids are living with. I think one of my saving graces with this disorder was my elementary teacher and my sense of humor. If I did not have my sense of humor, I would never have survived this disorder. You know that old adage, a funny thing happened to me on the way too? When you have Tourette syndrome, a funny thing happens to you on the way just about anywhere. Okay? You know the tic where I just made you do this? I have a tic, the same tic when I'm driving. I hit the windshield of my car constantly. Now, I know what I'm doing, but people driving by me think I'm giving them the finger. That's what it looks like. And so I'm driving happily to work in the morning, and people are driving by me, giving me the finger. Now, what is a person supposed to do? Throw pamphlets out the window, about Tourette syndrome? You can't do that. What are you supposed to do? So you just wave, have a nice day, and on we go. And I'm going to go to my world of Middle School in Williamsville, New York, where everybody knows I have Tourette, nobody really cares. And that's how life is easier for me. It's so hard for us to understand that this is a neurological dysfunction of the brain, that this is not intentional, outrageous behavior. Kids who just don't care, kids who don't want to try, we just have it in our mind. That's kind of how we were taught. I mean, and it's not the fault of educators. How many of you learned about these things when you were studying to be a teacher? I see very few hands being raised in this room. You simply didn't. They don't teach about these things in college when you're learning to be a teacher. I can think of years of teaching, 10, 15 years of teaching before I realized any of these things existed. And I can think back to kids that I taught that there's no question in my mind they had Tourette syndrome. I remember one boy who definitely had ADHD. There was no question there. But he also definitely had Tourette syndrome. He made a lot of noises. He had a lot, there were like monkey sounds. He had a lot of tics, like shaking of the head and all kinds of stuff that he did. And I can remember I was a second-year teacher. We were told that when Richard started with this nonsense is what it was called, and he started making these noises and doing the things he was doing, that we were to put him in the closet. That's what we were told. I mean, this is 30-some years ago. Well, the closet had a little air slot, so he wasn't going to die in there. But nonetheless, I really didn't want to put Richard in the closet. I didn't think that was a good thing to do. And so I was beside myself, and one day I thought, well, this is what I've been directed to do. I don't have tenure, I better do it. So I put him in there, and in 5 minutes I went and got him. I couldn't stand it anymore. So after class I called him up and I said, Richard, I've got a plan. You're going to sit in the front seat up here by the door, and if you see the principal coming, you're going to dive for the closet. That's where you're going to be, because I can't put you in the closet. But when I think back now, he simply had Tourette syndrome. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody had any idea. I didn't even know what I had. But we don't look at it as the same as somebody with a hearing impairment, somebody with a vision problem, because it's always a matter of maturity and responsibility. When you have a neurological dysfunction like ADHD or Tourette or any of the things we've talked about today, it's not a matter of responsibility. Just like you would never say to a kid who can't see well, I'm sorry, you can't have glasses for more than 6 weeks. You wouldn't take a child who is hearing impaired and say, we'll give you the hearing aid, but after 6 weeks, you're on your own. That's absolutely ridiculous that you should need that beyond that. Because that's what they need to function in life. That's how they're going to succeed. It's not something you can just show them once and they're going to get it. It's something that they have to have a tool to help them. These are kids who have trouble initiating. You give them you give them an assignment and they can't get started on it. They have trouble sequencing. They have trouble finishing things. Everything has to be broken down for them. I mean, these kids have trouble doing a test, paper with 3 sheets to it. They'll do one on this page, they go back to one on this page, they go to one on this page, and back and forth, and they don't remember what directions go with each section. They're doing the section wrong. They're not organized. They're not organized material-wise. They're not organized thought-wise. They just have such a hard time working independently. And, you start slow. It's like, first you're going to write 1 sentence. Then after they're up twice, and I'll say, now you've got to go back and write 3 sentences. Now they can do that because you've gotten them started. I will take a test that has 3 pages and say, do the first part of the page up to the red line and stop and come up and see me. Don't try to do the whole page at one time. And then I'll say to them, you look thirsty, you need a break, go get a drink of water, and then come back, start all over again. But this is what you have to do with these kids. Everything has to be broken down in small segments. But if we don't teach them how to do this, how will they ever learn to be successful adults? If we never gave them the tool, then we can't expect them to be responsible for something they don't have any control over. But once we put that in place for them, that becomes their responsibility. So it's not like these kids are without consequences. They could just have free reign and you're going to do all their work for them, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you give the kid the tool. One of the things we tend to forget about is the social-emotional aspect of Tourette. I think that when I look at kids in my classroom that I have taught through the years with Tourette, the biggest issues are social issues. The huge issues, because they're constantly standing out in the crowd, so to speak. They're constantly teased. They're constantly imitated. They're constantly made fun of. We've talked about the most common associated disorders, but I'm going to tell you about some of the other disorders that are not infrequent, let's put it that way, with Tourette syndrome. It doesn't mean they're the top three. They're not the big three, ADHD, OCD, and LD, but they are still frequent with Tourette syndrome. Depression is up there on the list, and I think doctors are more and more seeing that. The problem is it's hard to recognize depression in kids. It's very hard, and that's because kids don't know how to express depression. You know, an adult who is depressed may, crawl up in a corner and be very sad and be crying. Kids with depression tend to act out. They tend to become more aggressive. They tend to become oppositional. Those are the kind of things that you see when kids are depressed. And so many times it's looked at as a behavioral issue, and it's really a level of depression. Another thing we tend to see with kids and adults with Tourette is anxiety disorders. Panic attacks. All of this seems to be part and parcel. That's not uncommon. A large number of them have what we call sensory defensiveness. Now, sensory defensiveness means that their senses are heightened. And I think the most common is the tactile. Now, that means that they can't stand to be touched suddenly. They have a hard time with the feel of certain fabrics. They can't stand socks with seams. They can't stand how it feels on their foot. They don't like things that don't have an elastic waist. They're tactile defensive. Some of these kids have it in the area of vision. They can't stand real bright lights. They're under fluorescent lights, and it seems to bother them. Sometimes they'll have it in, obviously, the auditory we already talked about, because we talked about the oversensitive, auditory system and everything distracting them. If you realize that was a problem with this child, where do we go back to in our school? We talked about it before, the occupational therapist. They have some wonderful techniques, OTs do, to work with these kids. There's a brushing technique to cut down on the tactile defensiveness. There are all kinds of things. One little boy that I had that had such auditory difficulties, auditory sensory problems, that he went through auditory desensitization. And it was a whole series of therapies that he went through an audiologist, and it made a huge difference in how he reacted to the world. These kids are easily overstimulated. Now, when you think about in a school, where do these kids tend to get into the most difficulty? The playground, cafeteria, lunchroom, the hallways, the school bus. Those are our major areas. Why do kids with these disorders get into trouble in those places? Because there's too much stimulation. There's too much auditory stimulation. There's too much tactile stimulation. So it's like we know that they can't handle it. We put them there. They don't handle it. They get in trouble. We put them in timeout. How does that make them feel day after day after day when they spend their day in timeout? Because we're putting them in a situation that they can't handle anyway. It's like telling a kid in a wheelchair, if you can't walk up and sharpen your pencil, you go to timeout. That's exactly what it's doing. But they just can't handle these overstimulating situations because of the inability to kind of, clear out around them all of this sensory defensiveness that they just have a very hard time with. These are also kids, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, that tend to have very short-fused behavior. Very short-fused. It takes nothing to set them off. Imagine if your mother sent you to school and said, I don't care, I'm not cutting the tag out of your shirt, and I don't care if you don't like these socks with seams, you're going to wear them anyway. To me, the only way I can describe wearing something that I'm uncomfortable in like that, well, because of my tactile defensiveness, the only way I can describe it is thinking of having the worst sunburn you've ever had and being made to put on a wool sweater. Yeah, everybody goes, it cringes. That's what it's like to me. That's what it's like. And then not only do you have to put the wool sweater on, now you have to go function. You have to go to gym.